The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the Morgan Ranch, turning the grasslands golden and the distant mountains purple against a fading sky. Daniel Morgan sat in his rocking chair on the wide porch, his weathered hands resting on knees that had carried him through 85 years of life. The wood beneath him creaked with familiar rhythm, a sound he'd heard 10,000 times, maybe more. His great-grandson Ben sat cross-legged on the porch steps, 15 years old, and full of questions the way boys that age always were. The boy had been pestering him all week, wanting to know about the old days, about how things used to be, about how a man was supposed to stand in this world when everything around him was falling apart. Daniel studied the boy's face, seeing echoes of his own youth, there mixed with Grace's gentle features and something entirely new that belonged only to Ben. The world was changing again. War clouds gathering over Europe. Hard times coming same as always, just wearing different clothes. "Grandpa," Ben said, breaking the comfortable silence. "You always say a real man stands firm when everyone else falls. Where'd you learn that?" Daniel felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth, the kind that came from memory rather than present joy. His eyes drifted across the land he'd worked for, more than half a century, land that had seen blood and tears and triumph. "Let me tell you a story, boy," he said, his voice still strong despite his years. "About a time 53 years ago when I had to choose between standing up or staying silent. About a night in September 1885 that changed everything." Ben leaned forward, eager. "This isn't a story about a man saving a woman." Daniel continued, settling deeper into his chair. "This is about standing firm for what's right, no matter what comes at you. And it started, believe it or not, with a single bed." The old man's eyes went distant, seeing past the present moment into a time when he was young, and the West was still wild, and a man's word meant something, because it had to. "Close your eyes, Ben. Let me take you back." The dusty Spur Saloon sat at the rough end of Main Street, where the respectable part of town gave way to the necessary vices that kept a frontier settlement running. Daniel Morgan occupied his usual corner table, a glass of whiskey in front of him that he'd been nursing for the better part of an hour. At 32, he'd learned that watching was often more valuable than drinking. The saloon smelled of tobacco smoke, spilled beer, and the cheap perfume the working girls wore. Piano music tinkled from the corner where old Charlie worked the keys with more enthusiasm than skill. Men hunched over card games, their voices rising and falling with their fortunes. It was Thursday afternoon, the slow time before the weekend rush. Daniel sat with his back to the wall, as always. Old habits from the war. His Colt .45 rested in its holster, positioned just right, so he could reach it without thinking. His boots were dusty from a morning spent mending fence lines on his ranch, the kind of work that never ended, but had to be done. Jake, the bartender, brought over the bottle. They'd known each other since the war, fought at Shiloh together, seen things neither of them talked about anymore. "Ranch holding up, Dan?" Jake asked, keeping his voice low the way he always did in conversation. "Cattle market's down," Daniel replied, equally quiet. "But I'll manage." Jake nodded, understanding what wasn't said. Daniel always managed. Had to. The ranch was all he had left, the only thing he'd built since Emma died. 5 years now, and the ache hadn't faded, just settled into something he could live with. He took a small sip of whiskey, letting it burn down his throat, and returned his attention to watching. That's what he did in town these days. Watched, listened, waited for something he couldn't quite name. The door swung open, and Sheriff Coleman walked in. Daniel's eyes tracked the lawman across the room. Coleman was nervous, which was unusual. The sheriff was a hard man, made harder by whatever deal he'd struck with Charles Blackwell and the railroad interests. But today his eyes darted around the saloon like he was expecting trouble. Coleman caught Daniel's gaze and held it for a moment. No words exchanged, but plenty said in that look. They weren't friends, weren't enemies either. Just two men who understood each other's positions and stayed out of each other's way. The sheriff took a seat near the door, ordered whiskey, and waited. Daniel knew that posture. Coleman was waiting for someone important. The sound of a stagecoach rattling up Main Street filtered through the saloon's walls. Daniel heard it stop, heard the driver calling out, heard the creak of the door and the thud of bags hitting dirt. New arrival. Coyote Ridge didn't get many of those. Through the window, Daniel watched a woman step down from the coach. She wore black head to toe, widow's weeds, young, maybe late 20s, with auburn hair pulled back severe and proper. She carried herself straight despite obvious exhaustion, one hand clutching a worn carpet bag, the other shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. Coleman straightened in his chair, attention fixed on the woman. Daniel felt something shift in his gut. Instinct, maybe. The same sense that had kept him alive at Shiloh when cannonballs were tearing through the ranks. When a lawman took that much interest in a lone woman, it meant trouble. The woman looked around Main Street like she was searching for something, or someone. Then she picked up her bag and started walking, checking each building as she passed. The Grand Hotel first. Daniel watched through the window as she went inside, emerged a few minutes later with disappointment clear on her face, even from this distance. She tried Morrison's boarding house next. Same result. The Territorial Inn, the Cattleman's Rest. Every respectable lodging in town. Each time the same pattern. She'd go in hopeful, come out defeated. Daniel knew what was happening. He'd seen it before. A woman alone, no husband, no family. In a town like Coyote Ridge that made her suspect. Dangerous. Someone to be kept at arm's length. The afternoon wore on. The woman's steps got slower, heavier. She sat on a bench outside the dry goods store for a while, just staring at her hands. Daniel couldn't see her face clearly from this distance, but he could read defeat in the slump of her shoulders. When the sun started dropping toward the mountains and shadows stretched long across the dirt street, she stood up. She looked around one more time. Her gaze settled on the dusty spur, the only building still showing warm light in its windows. She hesitated. Even from here, Daniel could see the internal struggle. A decent woman didn't walk into a saloon, but a desperate woman might. She picked up her bag and crossed the street. The piano player Charlie was the first to notice when she pushed through the swinging doors. His fingers stumbled on the keys, producing a discordant jangle that cut through the conversation. Heads turned. Voices dropped to whispers. She stood in the doorway, backlit by the dying sun, and Daniel got his first clear look at her face. Pale skin that spoke of too many days indoors or traveling. Green eyes that held fear, but not surrender. A jawline set with determination that reminded him of soldiers he'd known, the ones who kept marching even when the cause was lost. The saloon went silent, except for the creak of a chair as someone shifted position. She walked toward the bar. Each step deliberate, her eyes fixed on Jake. Men at the tables watched her pass, some with curiosity, some with something uglier. One drunk started to say something crude, but his companion elbowed him quiet. Jake set down the glass he'd been polishing. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice carried in the silence. "You lost?" "I need a room," she said. Her voice was steady, educated Eastern. "Just for tonight." Laughter erupted from the card tables. Crude suggestions followed. Daniel didn't react, just kept watching, kept listening. Jake looked uncomfortable, which was rare. "Ma'am, this ain't exactly a hotel." "I've tried everywhere else," she said, and now Daniel heard the exhaustion underneath the steadiness. "Please." Jake scratched at his beard, glancing around the room. His eyes found Daniel's for a moment, a silent question there. Daniel gave the smallest shake of his head. "Not his business. Not yet." "Well," Jake said slowly, "I got one room upstairs, but it's already paid for by a regular who won't be back till tomorrow." The woman straightened. I'll leave before he returns. Jake hesitated again. There's another problem, ma'am. The room held its breath. That room's only got one bed. The words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel watched the woman's face, saw the calculation happening behind those green eyes. She knew what she was being offered, knew what it would mean, knew that saying yes would mark her in this town forever. She met Jake's eyes without flinching. That's perfect, she said. The saloon exploded. Whistles, shouts, laughter that had edges sharp as knives. Men slapped tables and elbowed each other. The painted girls exchanged knowing looks. Even Jake looked shocked. But the woman didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't apologize or explain or show even a flicker of shame. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out $2 silver, and placed them on the bar with a soft click. I'll take it, she said. Jake slid a key across the wood. She took it, turned, and walked toward the stairs. Every eye in the room followed her. Daniel watched her climb, watched her disappear down the upper hallway, heard a door close with finality. The noise resumed louder now, fueled by scandal and speculation. But Daniel stayed silent, turning his attention back to Coleman. The sheriff was watching the stairs with an expression Daniel recognized. Satisfaction mixed with calculation. Whatever this woman's story was, Coleman had an interest in it. Daniel's instincts, honed by years of survival, started ringing alarm bells. He waited until Coleman stood, drained his whiskey, and walked outside. Through the window, Daniel watched the sheriff meet up with his deputy on the street. They talked for a moment, heads close together. Then the deputy nodded and hurried off toward the telegraph office. Daniel made a decision. He stood, left money on the table for Jake, and followed Coleman outside at a distance. The sheriff was heading back toward his office, but Daniel didn't need to follow that far. He'd seen enough. The woman upstairs had attracted official attention, and in a town where the sheriff worked for Blackwell, that meant danger. Daniel walked to the stable where he'd left his horse. The animal, a gray gelding named Smoke, nickered softly at his approach. Not going home yet, boy? Daniel murmured, checking the saddle. Got a feeling tonight's going to be interesting. He didn't rent a room. Couldn't afford one anyway, and didn't need it. The stable loft would do fine. He'd slept in worse places during the war. At least here it was dry, and the hay was fresh. But he positioned himself where he had a clear view of the Dusty Spur's back entrance. If anyone came calling on that woman in the night, Daniel would see them. He settled in to wait, his hand resting on his Colt, his eyes on the saloon. The town quieted as the hours passed. Lamps extinguished one by one in windows up and down Main Street. The last drunk stumbled out of the Spur around 11, and Jake locked up shortly after. By midnight, Coyote Ridge was dark except for the quarter moon overhead and a scattering of stars. Daniel had checked his Colt twice more from habit than necessity. 6 rounds in the cylinder, fresh enough. His rifle leaned against the wall within easy reach. The night air was cool, carrying the smell of dust and distant pine from the mountains. He'd almost convinced himself nothing would happen when he heard them. 3 men moving quiet, but not quiet enough. Daniel recognized the walk of Coleman's deputies, even in darkness. They were trying for stealth, but boots on dirt still made sound if you knew how to listen. They approached the back of the Spur, stopped beneath what Daniel had already figured out was the woman's window. Second-floor corner room, the one with the cracked glass Jake had been meaning to fix for months. The deputies conferred in whispers Daniel couldn't quite make out. Then one of them tried the back door. Locked. They moved to the outside stairs, the wooden ones that led up to the second-floor hallway. Daniel's hand found his Colt. The men climbed slow, testing each step. At the top, they moved down the hallway. Daniel heard footsteps stop, heard a doorknob rattle. Then, cutting through the night, a woman's voice. Clear, steady, dangerous. I have a gun. Whoever's out there should leave. The deputies froze. Daniel heard them whispering again, heard the unmistakable sound of a pistol being cocked from inside the room. The woman wasn't bluffing. One of the deputies laughed low and mean. "Little lady thinks she's tough." But they didn't try the door again. Maybe they heard the conviction in her voice. Maybe they just weren't paid enough to take a bullet. Daniel decided it was time to make his presence known. He stood deliberately, letting his boots scuff on the stable floor, and stepped into the moonlight. Not walking toward the spur, just making himself visible, letting them know someone was watching. The deputies spotted him immediately. Daniel couldn't see their faces in the dark, but he felt their attention shift. One of them said something sharp, and all three started down the back stairs, moving faster now, their stealth abandoned. Daniel waited until they reached the ground before speaking. "Evening, boys. Late night for a stroll." They recognized his voice. One of them, Crane, spat into the dust. "Private business, Morgan. Keep out of it." "Didn't realize the sheriff's office made house calls after midnight," Daniel said, keeping his tone mild conversational. "Must be important business." "Ain't your concern?" "Maybe, maybe not. But I'm a light sleeper and I notice things." The deputies knew Daniel's reputation. Knew he'd been a sharpshooter in the war, knew he didn't miss, knew he didn't bluff. They also knew he kept to himself and didn't look for trouble. But they didn't know what he'd do if trouble found him. After a tense moment, Crane jerked his head at the others. "Come on, we got our answer anyway." They walked off into the darkness, heading back toward the center of town. Daniel waited until he couldn't hear their footsteps anymore, then turned his attention back to the spur. A shadow moved in the woman's window. She'd been watching. Daniel crossed the street, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. He climbed the back stairs, each step producing a soft creak that announced his approach. When he reached her door, he stopped. Didn't try the handle, didn't knock. Just spoke loud enough to carry through the wood, but quiet enough not to wake anyone else. "Ma'am, my name's Daniel Morgan. I rent this room regular. Just wanted to let you know those men are gone. You're safe tonight." Silence. Then the sound of a chain sliding. The door opened a crack. In the dim light, Daniel saw one green eye studying him, and below it, the barrel of a pistol. "You know guns?" he said, noting the weapon. "That's a Remington 41. Good choice for close quarters." The door opened another inch. "You served in the war." It wasn't a question. Something in his bearing must have given him away. "Shiloh," he confirmed. 62. Been around firearms ever since." "Why are you here?" "Because those deputies answer to Sheriff Coleman, and Coleman answers to Charles Blackwell. And when a lone woman shows up in town asking questions, Blackwell tends to take an interest. Figured you might need someone watching your back." "You don't know me." "No, ma'am. But I know trouble when I see it coming." The woman was quiet for a moment, then, "Where will you sleep?" "Stable. It's comfortable enough. But if you need anything, if anyone bothers you, fire 2 shots. I'll hear them. I'll come." "Why help a stranger?" Daniel felt the weight of 5 years settle on him. Emma's face flashed through his mind, the way she'd looked that last morning, smiling, telling him not to worry about the fence line, she'd be fine until he got back. "Because 5 years ago I didn't help someone when it mattered," he said, keeping his voice steady with effort. "She died. I won't make that mistake twice." The woman's expression softened just barely. She saw the pain there, recognized it. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan." "Daniel. Just Daniel." "Grace," she said after a pause. "Grace Hartley." The door closed, the chain slid back into place, and Daniel made his way back down the stairs. But as he crossed toward the stable, he heard voices from the alley beside the sheriff's office. He moved into the shadows, listening. Coleman's voice carried in the still night air. "Blackwell wants her gone by week's end. I don't care how." Another voice, one of the deputies. "What if Morgan's involved?" then Morgan becomes a problem too. Daniel felt cold certainty settle in his chest. This wasn't harassment. This was murder being planned. He made it back to the stable and settled in the loft, but sleep was impossible now. He lay there, rifle across his lap, watching the dusty spur until dawn broke over the mountains. The sun rose red and gold, painting the Colorado peaks with fire. Daniel hadn't slept. Hadn't really expected to. His eyes felt gritty, his body stiff from a night in the loft, but his mind was clear. He'd spent the dark hours thinking, planning, remembering. Grace Hartley. The name had sounded familiar last night, but he couldn't place it. Now, as the details came back, he remembered. Thomas Hartley, mining engineer at Blackwell's operation up in the mountains. The man had written detailed reports about safety violations, about corners being cut, about disaster waiting to happen. Daniel had read those reports when they were briefly available at the territorial office before someone made them disappear. 2 months after those reports surfaced, the mine collapsed. 18 men died, including Thomas Hartley. Official inquiry ruled it an accident. Blackwell paid modest compensation to the families and kept operating. Case closed. Except it wasn't an accident. Daniel had known it, then known it in his bones, the same way he'd known Emma's fire wasn't an accident. But knowing and proving were different things. Now Thomas Hartley's widow was here in Coyote Ridge, and that couldn't be coincidence. Daniel climbed down from the loft, brushed hay from his clothes, and washed his face in the trough outside. The cold water helped with the tiredness. He checked his Colt again, more from ritual than need, and headed toward the spur. The town was waking up. Shopkeepers opening their doors, the smithy's forge already glowing red. Someone sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store. Daniel positioned himself near the spur's entrance, leaning against a post like he was just passing time. In truth, he was waiting for Grace. She emerged 20 minutes later, still wearing black, her carpet bag in hand. In daylight, he could see the exhaustion clearly, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly before she steadied them with visible effort. She saw him and paused. Daniel tipped his hat. "Morning, ma'am." "Mr. Morgan." "Daniel." "Daniel," she corrected and kept walking. He followed at a respectful distance, far enough back not to crowd her close enough to intervene if needed. What happened next made his jaw tighten. Grace walked down Main Street, and it was like watching the Red Sea part. Women pulled their children to the other side of the street. Men stopped talking and stared. Whispers followed her like a wake. At Carter's laundry, she knocked. Mrs. Carter opened the door, took one look at Grace, and said something short before closing it again. Grace's shoulders stiffened, but she moved on. At the general store, Mr. Peterson sold her supplies, but wouldn't meet her eyes. Quoted prices Daniel knew were inflated. At the post office, she asked about someone named Marcus. The clerk shook his head. No forwarding address. Grace stood on the post office steps for a moment, and Daniel saw her composure crack just slightly. Saw her close her eyes, take a deep breath, force herself back together. Then, Sheriff Coleman appeared. He stepped out from beside the bank directly into Grace's path, hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that wasn't quite threatening, but wasn't friendly either. "Mrs. Hartley," Coleman said, and Daniel heard the false courtesy in his tone. "Heard you caused quite a stir last night." "I rented a room, Sheriff. That's hardly a crime." Coleman circled her slowly like a buzzard eyeing prey. "The dusty spur ain't a place for respectable women." "It was the only place that would have me." "Is that right? Funny, because I know for a fact there were vacancies at the Territorial Inn. Mrs. Morrison had space at her boarding house, too." Grace's face went pale as she understood. Those doors had been closed deliberately. "Coyote Ridge is a respectable town, Mrs. Hartley. We have standards, A woman alone, no family, no husband. She needs to find proper lodgings, proper company. And if I don't? Grace asked quietly. Coleman's smile was thin as paper. Then accidents happen. Women with no one to protect them sometimes disappear. Territory's dangerous after all. Daniel had heard enough. He stepped off the boardwalk, boots hitting dirt with deliberate sound. Coleman turned, irritation flashing across his face. "Morning, Sheriff," Daniel said evenly. "Private conversation, Morgan." Didn't look private. It looked like intimidation to me. Coleman's hand stayed on his gun. "You got business here?" "Just passing through. Couldn't help but overhear you threatening a citizen." "I'm the law in this town." "Then act like it." The two men stared at each other. Daniel didn't move his hand toward his Colt, didn't need to. Coleman knew what he was capable of, knew that starting something here in the middle of Main Street could go badly wrong. Coleman broke the stare first. "Stay out of things that don't concern you, Morgan." "I'll decide what concerns me." The sheriff turned and walked away, but not before shooting Grace a look that promised this wasn't over. Grace stood frozen, breathing hard. "You all right?" Daniel asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's walk." They moved down the street, away from curious eyes, toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land. Grace didn't speak, just walked, her bag clutched tight. Finally, when they were out of immediate earshot, she stopped. "Why are you helping me? Told you last night." "That's not enough. You don't know me. Don't know my situation." Daniel studied her face, seeing the intelligence there, the strength barely held together by will. "Your husband was Thomas Hartley, the mining engineer." Her eyes widened. "How did you know?" "I read his reports about the safety violations at Blackwell's mine. 2 months later, the mine collapsed and Thomas died." Grace's throat worked. "Along with 17 other men. And you came here looking for someone. Marcus, you said at the post office. Thomas's cousin. He was supposed to have evidence proof that the collapse wasn't an accident. But he's gone." Daniel nodded slowly. "Marcus Hartley works for Blackwell now. Has for years." The color drained from Grace's face. "No, he wouldn't. He was Thomas's family. People do strange things when Blackwell makes it worth their while." Grace swayed slightly. Daniel caught her elbow, steadied her. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered. "Yes, you do." She looked up at him, confused. "My ranch. 5 miles outside town. I need help. Someone who can cook, keep books, manage supplies. Room and board plus $30 a month." "Why would you offer that?" "Because you need it. And because your husband tried to stand up to Blackwell. I've been trying to do the same thing for 5 years. Maybe together we have a better chance." Grace searched his face, looking for deception, for ulterior motives. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she straightened. "Equal partners?" Daniel extended his hand. "Equal partners." She shook it, her grip firm despite the tremor. They turned back toward town to collect her things, but when they reached the spur, Grace stopped dead. The door to her room hung open. Inside, they could see the devastation. Her carpet bag had been torn apart, contents scattered. And Thomas's journal, the one thing she'd managed to keep safe all this time, was gone. "They knew," Grace said numbly. "Someone told them what I had." Daniel's mind raced. Jake. It had to be. The bartender who'd been his friend, his war companion, had sold them out to Coleman. "We need to leave," Daniel said. "Now, before they come back." Grace gathered what little remained of her possessions, while Daniel kept watch. 10 minutes later, they were riding out of Coyote Ridge in a borrowed wagon, the town receding behind them. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the bank. Sheriff Coleman stood there, arms crossed, a cold smile on his face. The ride to Daniel's property took them through open grassland that rolled like a frozen ocean toward the mountains. September had turned the grass gold and amber, and the aspens on the hillsides were starting to flame yellow. Daniel drove the wagon in silence, checking behind them periodically. Grace sat beside him, numb with shock and exhaustion. "You should rest," he said after a while. "Can't. Too many thoughts." He understood that. After Emma died, he'd gone weeks without proper sleep, his mind churning endlessly over what-ifs and should-haves. "Thomas wrote everything down," Grace said suddenly. "Every violation, every warning he gave, every time Blackwell's foreman told him to ignore safety protocols. That journal was proof. And now Blackwell has it. Or he's destroyed it." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then, "Maybe not." Grace looked at him. "Blackwell's careful, methodical. If that journal's as detailed as you say, he might keep it. Insurance against the day someone turns on him, or proof he can use to implicate others if he needs to. Where would he keep it? Don't know yet. But if it still exists, we'll find it." The ranch came into view as they crested a low hill. It wasn't much. A small house, weathered but solid. A barn that had seen better days. Corrals, a well, a chicken coop. 50 head of cattle scattered across the pasture. "It's not fancy," Daniel said, suddenly aware of how rough it must look to someone from back east. "It's perfect," Grace said, and meant it. Daniel showed her around the property. The well had good water year-round. The barn needed new shingles, but the frame was sound. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a main room with a fireplace. "That one's yours," he said, pointing to the smaller bedroom. "Door locks from the inside. Your privacy." Grace stepped inside. The room held a narrow bed with a handmade quilt, a washstand, a small mirror, and a chest of drawers. The window looked west toward the mountains. "Wages are $30 a month," Daniel continued. "That's separate from the room and board. You're not a servant, you're an employee." Grace turned to look at him. "You're very careful about boundaries." "Respect matters," he said simply. That first evening, Grace cooked a simple dinner. Beans, cornbread, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Daniel ate like it was a feast. "Been living on jerky and canned goods," he admitted. After dinner, they sat at the rough table. Daniel spread out the ranch's account books, which were a disaster of receipts and scattered notes. "I'm terrible with numbers," he said. "Always have been." Grace studied the mess, her fingers already organizing sorting. "I can fix this." "I was hoping you'd say that." They worked in companionable silence for a while. Grace made notes, asked questions about expenses, and started building a proper ledger. Daniel watched her work, seeing the sharp intelligence that Thomas Hartley must have loved. When she finally looked up, exhaustion clear on her face, Daniel stood. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we start figuring out what Blackwell's really doing and how we stop him." Grace nodded and retired to her room. Daniel heard the lock click, a sound that pleased him. She felt safe enough to sleep. He sat by the fire for another hour, thinking, planning. Then he too went to bed, though sleep was slow to come. Hidden evidence. Morning brought clear skies and crisp air. Daniel woke early as always and started the coffee. He was frying bacon when Grace emerged, looking more rested. "Morning," he said. "Morning. Is there anything you need me to do today?" "Clean your room if you want. Settle in. I've got fence work." But when Grace went to her room to organize her few possessions, she found something that changed everything. A loose floorboard. It rocked when she stepped on it. Curious, she knelt and pried it up. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather portfolio. "Daniel," she called, keeping her voice level, "you should see this." He came immediately, saw the portfolio in her hands, and nodded slowly. "I figured you'd find that. eventually. Grace opened it on the table. Inside were maps, land deeds, letters, newspaper clippings. Years of careful documentation. "You've been investigating him," she said. "5 years now, since Emma died." Grace spread the papers out. Each document told part of a story. Land acquisitions along a specific route. Families displaced. Properties sold for fractions of their value. Accidents, fires, poisoned wells. "The railroad," Grace said, tracing the line on the map with her finger, "needs a specific grade. Can't be steeper than 2% or the trains can't make it. This route," Daniel tapped the map, "is the only viable path through the mountains. Every family along this line, Blackwell needs their land. And the ones who wouldn't sell. Anderson family. Well poisoned with arsenic compounds. I had the water tested by a chemist in Denver. Proof's in there." Grace found the report. Clinical detailed damning. Miller family. Cattle diseased. Anthrax deliberately introduced. I found the injection sites on the carcasses before they were burned. Thompson family. Barn fire. Accelerant used. You can still smell it on the timbers if you know what to look for. Grace's hands shook as she went through the evidence. "This is everything. Why haven't you gone to the authorities?" "Because the authorities are bought. Coleman works for Blackwell. The territorial judge takes bribes. Even the federal marshal's been slow-walking investigations. Then what's the point of gathering evidence? Because someday someone honest might come along. Or someone with enough power that Blackwell can't buy them. When that happens, I want to be ready." Grace pulled out Thomas's photograph from her bag, one of the few things that had survived the theft. She set it on the table next to the documents. "Thomas found something too, about Marcus." Daniel's attention sharpened. Marcus was falsifying inspection reports, taking bribes from Blackwell. When Thomas confronted him, Marcus warned Blackwell. That's why the mine collapsed when it did. They couldn't let Thomas submit his findings to the federal inspectors. "Where's the proof?" "In the journal they stole." Daniel sat back thinking. "We need Marcus. If we can turn him, get him to testify, we might have a case. He helped kill my husband. Why would I want him to testify instead of hanging? Because one guilty man testifying puts 20 guilty men in prison. Justice isn't just about revenge." Grace met his eyes. "Is that what you tell yourself about Emma?" The words stung because they were accurate. Daniel had spent 5 years telling himself he wanted justice when some deep part of him wanted Blackwell to suffer the way Emma had suffered. "I'm trying to be better than my worst impulses," he said quietly. Grace softened. "I'm sorry. That was unfair. It was honest." They returned to the documents, cross-referencing dates and events. As they worked, a clearer picture emerged. Blackwell's operation was larger than either of them had suspected. Not just Colorado, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming. A network of corruption stretching across the territories. Grace found a photograph tucked in the back of the portfolio. 3 men standing together. Charles Blackwell, Sheriff Coleman, and a third man she recognized with a shock. "Marcus?" she breathed. The photo was dated 3 months before Thomas's death. On the back, in flowing script, "Partnership formed. New era for Colorado." Daniel studied it. This proves connection, but not criminal conspiracy. What do we need? Someone inside. Someone who can testify to direct orders. Marcus? Or someone else in Blackwell's organization? As Grace dug deeper in the portfolio, she found something Daniel had missed. A letter hidden between 2 land deeds. The handwriting was different from the others, more refined. She read it aloud. "Charles, accelerate the Colorado timeline. Railroad board nervous about delays. Remove all obstacles. Budget approved for necessary expenses, $50,000. Make it look natural. William. Grace looked up. William? William Blackwell. Charles's older brother, based in New York, runs the financial side of the railroad empire. He authorized this 2 weeks before the mine collapse, according to the date. They stared at each other as the implications sank in. Charles Blackwell wasn't acting alone. He was following orders from New York, which meant the conspiracy went higher, deeper than either of them had imagined. A sound outside made them both freeze. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders. Daniel moved to the window, peered through the curtain. 4 men on horseback approaching the house at a steady pace. He recognized 2 of Coleman's deputies. The others were guns-for-hire men who sold violence to the highest bidder. "Grace," he said calmly, "go to your room. Bar the door. Don't come out unless I tell you." "What's happening?" "Coleman's sending a message. Now go." Grace grabbed the portfolio and ran. Daniel heard her door close, heard furniture scrape as she barricaded it. He checked his Colt, made sure he had extra ammunition, and positioned himself by the front window where he had a clear field of fire. The riders stopped 20 yards from the house. "Morgan," one of them called. "Send out the woman." Daniel didn't answer. "We know she's in there. Blackwell wants to talk to her." Still no response. "You got 5 minutes to send her out, or we come in." Daniel's mind raced, calculating odds, planning responses. 4 against 1. Not great odds, but he'd faced worse at Shiloh. Then he heard something that changed everything. More hoofbeats. Coming from the other direction from town. The riders heard it too, turned to look. A group of townspeople crested the hill. Daniel recognized Ruth Anderson, whose well had been poisoned. Jack Miller, who'd lost his cattle. Pastor Williams from the church. A dozen others, all armed, all riding hard. Judge Harrison led them, his white hair flying, an old military saber hanging from his saddle. "Coleman's men," the judge called out, his voice carrying authority even across the distance. "You're trespassing on private property. Leave now or face arrest." The deputies exchanged glances. 4 of them against a dozen armed citizens with Daniel's rifle in the window suddenly didn't seem like good odds. The leader made a gesture, and they wheeled their horses, riding back toward town at a gallop. The townspeople reined in at Daniel's porch. Harrison dismounted, moving with the stiffness of age, but the determination of old steel. "Daniel," he said, "you all right?" "Yes, sir. How'd you know?" "Ruth saw them riding this way. Figured they weren't coming for friendly conversation." Grace emerged from the house, portfolio clutched to her chest. Harrison looked at her, then at Daniel. "Perhaps you'd better tell me what's going on." They went inside. For the next 2 hours, Daniel and Grace laid out everything. The evidence, the pattern, the conspiracy. Harrison listened without interrupting, his face growing graver by the minute. When they finished, the old judge sat back in his chair. "I've been waiting for this," he said quietly. "Sir?" Daniel asked. "For someone to stand up. Really stand up. I've watched Blackwell destroy this territory for years. Tried to fight him through proper channels. But he's bought too many people, scared too many others." "Are you saying you'll help us?" Harrison's eyes hardened. "I'm saying I'll do more than help. I'm saying it's time to bring Blackwell down. Legal, proper, by the book. But down." Grace leaned forward. "How?" "Federal prosecutor. This crosses state lines now, involves railroad commerce, that makes it federal jurisdiction. I have contacts in Denver. If we can build a solid case, they'll listen." "What do we need?" Daniel asked. "More evidence. Testimony from someone inside Blackwell's operation, and time." "How much time?" 2 months, maybe 3. There's a railroad board meeting in Denver on October 15th. If Blackwell secures that contract, he becomes untouchable. We need to move before then. Daniel looked at Grace. She nodded. Then we have work to do, Daniel said. But as the meeting broke up and people began to leave, a rider arrived. Young Billy from the telegraph office, his horse lathered from hard riding. Judge Mr. Morgan, message from Denver. Harrison took the telegram, read it, and his face went pale. What is it? Daniel asked. Marcus Hartley was found dead this morning. Apparent suicide. Single gunshot to the head. Grace made a sound like she'd been struck. Daniel felt cold wash over him. Or murder made to look like suicide, Harrison said grimly. They're cleaning up loose ends, Daniel said, removing anyone who could testify. The judge looked at both of them. Which means you're both in immediate danger. If they killed Marcus, they won't hesitate to kill you. Grace's face had gone white, but her voice was steady. Then we'd better move faster than they expect. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. Not romantic, just solidarity. Two people who'd chosen to stand when everyone else had fallen. Together, he said. Together, she agreed. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire. The last light of September was fading into darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, Charles Blackwell was planning his next move, unaware that for the first time in his life, he was facing opponents who wouldn't break, wouldn't run, wouldn't stop. The war for justice had begun. The morning after Marcus's death arrived cold and sharp. Frost covered the grassland in silver crystals that melted under the first touch of sun. Daniel stood on his porch, coffee steaming in his hands, watching the horizon for movement. Sleep had been brief and troubled. Every sound in the night had brought him to full alertness, hand reaching for the Colt by his bedside. Grace emerged from the house, wrapped in a shawl against the chill. She'd been awake when he rose, he knew. He'd heard her moving around her room, the quiet sounds of someone who couldn't find rest. They killed him, she said without preamble. My cousin, however terrible he was, they killed him. Probably, Daniel agreed. Loose ends get tied up when things get serious. We're loose ends too. Yes. Grace looked at him. You're very calm about this. Been expecting it. Since the night those deputies tried your door at the Spur, this was always going to get violent before it got resolved. Thomas used to say something similar about the mine. He knew reporting violations would bring trouble. Did it anyway. Daniel nodded. Some things are worth the risk. A rider appeared on the eastern road, moving fast. Daniel's hand moved toward his gun, but he recognized the horse, one of Judge Harrison's animals. The rider pulled up hard, the horse's hooves throwing divots of frost-covered earth. It was Claire Whitmore, the woman from the dusty Spur. But she looked different. Her usual saloon clothes were replaced by a simple traveling dress. Her face was pale beneath a fresh cut on her temple, blood dried in a thin line down her cheek. She half fell from the saddle. Daniel caught her before she hit the ground. Jake's dead, she gasped. Coleman shot him. Burned the Spur. They're coming here. Grace ran for water while Daniel helped Claire to the porch. She was shaking, whether from cold or shock he couldn't tell. Slow down, he said. Tell me what happened. Claire took the water Grace offered and drank deep. Last night, after midnight, Coleman came with 10 men. Said Jake had been talking, helping you. Jake tried to defend himself, saying he hadn't told you anything important. Coleman didn't care. Shot him in the saloon right in front of everyone. Then set the building on fire. The girls, Grace asked, scattered. Most ran to friends' places. I came here because I have something Coleman wants. She reached into her bodice and pulled out a small leather notebook. 15 years of records. Every transaction, every dirty deal, every payment I witnessed at the Spur. Daniel took the notebook, flipped through pages of neat handwriting. Dates, names, amounts. It was meticulous. "Why keep this?" he asked. Claire's face hardened. "My real name is Claire Whitmore. My father was Professor James Whitmore. He taught geology at Denver University. Blackwell hired him to survey the railroad route 15 years ago." "I remember that name," Daniel said slowly. "Papa found irregularities in Blackwell's mineral rights claims, false assessments to justify land seizures. When he confronted Blackwell about it, he died in a carriage accident 2 weeks later. I was 17, no money, no family. Ended up at the Spur." Grace reached out and took Claire's hand. "I'm so sorry. I've been waiting 15 years for revenge. This notebook is how I get it. Every payment Coleman took, every bribe, every order, all traced back to Blackwell." "You said they're coming here," Daniel said, refocusing. "When?" "Soon. Coleman was gathering more men when I left. He knows about the evidence you have, about Judge Harrison's involvement. He's planning to hit you before you can get to federal authorities." Daniel's mind shifted into tactical mode, the same clarity that had kept him alive at Shiloh. "How many men?" 20, maybe more." Grace stood. "We can't fight 20 men." "No," Daniel agreed. "But we can survive them. Claire, can you ride another 5 miles? If I have to. Go to Judge Harrison's ranch. Tell him what happened. Tell him to gather everyone who'll fight and bring them here, fast." Claire nodded and headed for her horse, moving with the determination of someone running on pure will. Daniel turned to Grace. "We need to prepare this place for a siege." The next 2 hours were a controlled chaos of preparation. Daniel positioned rifles at strategic windows. He and Grace filled every container they had with water from the well. They moved all the evidence, Claire's notebook and Thomas's remaining papers, to the root cellar, hidden under sacks of potatoes. "If they burn the house," Grace said, "at least the evidence survives." "That's the idea." Grace checked her pistol, reloaded it with steady hands. "I killed a man in Denver, during the preliminary hearing when William's lawyer attacked." "Did I mention that?" Daniel looked at her. "No. I shot him. Self-defense, they ruled. But I killed him." Her voice was flat, recounting fact. "I thought I'd feel more. Guilt, horror, something. But I just felt relieved. That terrifies me more than the killing did." "You're still human," Daniel said. "Just learning that survival sometimes requires hard choices." "Is that what you tell yourself?" "Every day since Shiloh." They heard the sound before they saw anything. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses moving at a steady pace, not rushing, not cautious. The sound of men who believed they had overwhelming force. Daniel counted silently. 20 riders, just as Claire had said. Coleman at the front, his badge catching the morning sun. Behind him, a mix of deputies and hired gunsmen whose loyalties went to whoever paid most. They stopped 50 yards from the house, forming a loose semicircle. Coleman remained mounted, making himself a clear target. Either brave or stupid, Daniel couldn't decide which. "Morgan," Coleman's voice carried across the open ground. "Send out the women. You can ride away from this." Daniel positioned himself at the front window, rifle ready. Grace took the side window, her pistol in hand. "Not happening, Coleman," Daniel called back. "Then you die here, all 3 of you." "Maybe. But some of your men die too. You want to tell them that? Tell them who goes first." Several of the hired guns shifted nervously in their saddles. Death was one thing when it happened to someone else. Personal risk was different. Coleman conferred with his men, voices low. Then he made a gesture and 5 of them dismounted, taking cover behind a water trough and some barrels near the barn. "Last chance, Morgan." Daniel's answer was a single rifle shot, that kicked up dirt 3 inches from Coleman's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing the sheriff. The siege began. The first assault was probing testing. 10 men advanced on foot while the rest provided covering fire from their positions. Daniel let them get close, calculating angles and distances the way he'd learned in the war. "Hold," he said to Grace. "Wait for my signal." The men reached 30 yards, 25. Now, Daniel's first shot took a man in the shoulder. Deliberate placement meant to wound, not kill. The man screamed and fell. Grace fired twice, both shots near misses that sent attackers diving for cover. Return fire shattered the front window. Glass exploded inward, raining down on Daniel's back. He ignored it, worked the lever action, and fired again. The attackers retreated, dragging their wounded companion. "Good shooting," Daniel said. "I missed," Grace replied. "On purpose, I noticed. Trying not to kill if you don't have to." "Is that wrong?" "No, it's decent. But if they rush again, decent might not be enough." They didn't have to wait long. Coleman, frustrated by the initial failure, ordered a more aggressive assault. This time, 15 men came at once, spreading wide to make themselves harder targets. Daniel shifted positions constantly, firing from different windows to make it seem like there were more defenders than there actually were. Grace did the same, moving between the side and rear windows. 2 attackers reached the porch. Daniel shot one through the door, the heavy wood barely slowing the bullet. The man fell backward, clutching his leg. His companion hauled him away. But Coleman had learned. While the main assault drew their attention to the front, 3 men circled around back. Daniel heard boots on the rear porch too late. The back door crashed open. A man rushed through, gun raised. Grace was there. She fired point blank, the muzzle flash lighting the dim kitchen. The man went down hard. Behind him, another attacker appeared. Daniel sprinted from the front room, raised his rifle. But the angle was wrong. Grace was in the way. The second attacker aimed at Grace. A shotgun blast from outside blew the door frame apart, catching the attacker in the side. He stumbled and fell. Judge Harrison appeared in the doorway, still holding his smoking shotgun, his white hair wild around his face. "Thought you might need help," the old judge called. Behind him, Daniel saw the most beautiful sight he'd witnessed since the end of the war. 20 townspeople on horseback, all armed, spread out to flank Coleman's position. Ruth Anderson was there, her rifle already cracking as she found her position. Jack Miller, his wounded leg strapped tight, took cover behind the well and started picking off targets. Pastor Williams, an unlikely warrior in his black coat, carried an old army carbine and used it with surprising skill. Coleman's men suddenly found themselves caught in a crossfire. The odds had shifted from 20 against 2 to 20 against 22. And Coleman's hired guns weren't paid enough to die in fair fights. The sheriff shouted orders, trying to rally his men. But discipline broke. 3 of the hired guns threw down their weapons and ran for their horses. Then 5 more. The remaining men took cover wherever they could find it, more concerned with survival than victory. Daniel used the lull to reload, checking his ammunition. Running low. Another sustained assault, and they'd be in trouble. Coleman seemed to realize his attack had failed. He called for retreat, and his remaining men pulled back to their horses, mounted, and rode hard for town. The townspeople didn't pursue. They maintained their positions until the last rider disappeared over the rise, then slowly emerged from cover. Harrison walked into the house, his old face grim. "Everyone all right?" "Shaken but alive," Daniel said. "Thank you, Judge. You saved us." "Thank Claire. She rode like the devil himself was chasing her to reach my place." Grace appeared from the kitchen, her face pale but composed. She'd covered the body of the man she'd killed with a blanket. "We can't stay here. They'll come back with more men." "Agreed," Harrison said. "My ranch is more defensible. Stone walls, better sight lines. We move everyone there and consolidate our position." What about the evidence? Daniel asked. We take it with us, along with Claire's notebook, and we sent word to Denver immediately. The federal marshal needs to know what's happening here. They spent the next hour organizing the evacuation. The evidence was loaded into wagons covered with hay. Daniel released his cattle to open pasture, hoping some would survive whatever came next. Grace took only what she could carry. As they prepared to leave, Daniel took one last look at the ranch house. 5 years of work of rebuilding, of trying to create something lasting. Now he was abandoning it, not knowing if it would be standing when he returned. Grace appeared beside him. We'll come back. You sound certain. I have to be. If I let doubt in, I'll fall apart. They rode out in a convoy, townspeople surrounding the wagons, eyes scanning for threats. The journey to Harrison's ranch took 2 hours, every minute tense, with expectation of ambush. But they arrived without incident. Harrison's property sat on higher ground, the house built of stone with thick walls and narrow windows. It had been designed by someone who understood defense. My grandfather built this, Harrison explained, during the Indian Wars. Figured if he was going to settle this land, he'd best build something that could withstand a siege. They unloaded the wagons, storing the evidence in Harrison's study. Claire collapsed into a chair, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline. Ruth Anderson and the other women began preparing food for the defenders. Jack Miller organized watch rotations. Daniel found himself on the porch with Harrison, both men staring out at the approach road. This is really happening, the judge said quietly. War against Blackwell, against corruption, against everything wrong in this territory. Been happening for years, Daniel replied. We're just finally fighting back. People will die. People have been dying. Emma, Thomas, 18 miners, Jake, Marcus. How many more before we say enough? Harrison nodded slowly. You're right. But it still weighs heavy. That evening, gathered in Harrison's large main room, they held a war council. Every defender was present, along with Grace and Claire. We can't win a straight fight, Daniel began, standing at the head of the table. Blackwell has more men, more money, more resources. But we have something he doesn't. What's that? Ruth asked. We're right, and people know it. Even Coleman's men, some of them are starting to question. That's why they ran today. Because deep down, they know they're fighting for the wrong side. Pretty words, Jack Miller said. But how do we turn that into victory? We make this public, Harrison said. We force Blackwell into the light. Right now, he operates in the shadows, bribing officials, intimidating witnesses. We bring him into federal court in front of a jury with evidence that can't be ignored. How long until we can do that? Grace asked. The federal prosecutor in Denver has agreed to hear our case. But she needs time to review evidence, prepare charges. 2 weeks minimum. Blackwell won't give us 2 weeks, Daniel said. He'll hit us again harder this time. Then we survive, Harrison replied. We hold this position. We protect the evidence and the witnesses, and we wait for justice to catch up. Claire spoke up from her corner. There's another way, a faster way. All eyes turned to her. Coleman, she said. He's not evil. He's weak. Blackwell has something on him, some hold that keeps him loyal. If we can break that hold, flip him to our side, he can testify. Immediately. Why would he flip? Ruth asked skeptically. Because he's terrified, Claire said. I've watched him for years at the Spur. Every time Blackwell gave him an order, Coleman died a little inside. He's not a killer by nature. He's a man who got trapped and can't see a way out. Daniel considered this. You're suggesting we offer him a way out. Exactly. Immunity for testimony, protection for his family, a chance at redemption. He doesn't deserve redemption, Grace said, her voice hard. He's responsible for countless crimes. Maybe not, Claire agreed. But he's also our best chance at a quick conviction. And isn't that worth something? The room fell silent as everyone processed this. Finally, Harrison spoke. Federal prosecutors can offer immunity deals. But Coleman would have to give us something substantial. Full confession. Names, dates, direct evidence of Blackwell's orders. He has that, Claire said. I know he does. He keeps records too. Insurance in case Blackwell ever turns on him. Daniel walked to the window, looked out at the darkening sky. His instinct was to reject the idea to let Coleman face full justice for his crimes. But his tactical mind saw the value. If we can flip Coleman, he said slowly, Blackwell loses his enforcement arm in this territory. His deputy, his insider. That's a significant blow. More than that, Harrison added. Coleman's testimony carries weight. He's law enforcement. A jury will believe him over hired guns or saloon workers. He glanced at Claire. No offense. None taken. I know how the world sees me. Grace stood. I need air. She walked outside. Daniel followed after a moment, found her on the porch, gripping the railing hard enough to whiten her knuckles. You disagree, he said. Coleman destroyed lives, killed people. And we're talking about letting him walk free, not free, reduced sentence. He'd still serve time. It's not enough. Thomas died because Coleman looked the other way, because he followed Blackwell's orders. And now we reward that. Daniel leaned against the railing beside her. I understand. After Emma died, I wanted Blackwell to suffer. I wanted him to feel every moment of pain I felt. Spent years feeding that anger. What changed? I realized anger was killing me faster than Blackwell ever could. That revenge wasn't justice. That sometimes the right thing feels wrong, because it means letting go of what we think we deserve. Grace was quiet for a long moment. I'm not as good a person as you. You're better than you think. Better than you give yourself credit for. I killed 2 men today, Daniel. Shoot them without hesitation. And I'd do it again. To protect yourself. To protect others. That's not the same as murder. How do you know where the line is? You feel it. Right here. He tapped his chest. When you cross it, you know. Trust yourself. Grace turned to look at him. Really look at him. In the fading light, she saw the man he was beneath the quiet exterior. Someone who'd been broken and rebuilt himself. Someone who carried guilt, but didn't let it define him. All right, she said finally. We try to flip Coleman. But if he refuses, if he keeps serving Blackwell, then no mercy. Agreed. They went back inside. Daniel explained Grace's conditions. The group accepted them. Now we just need to get Coleman to talk to us, Harrison said. Which means getting him alone away from Blackwell's influence. I can do that, Claire said. Too dangerous, Ruth protested. You just escaped. Going back to town is suicide. Not if I'm careful. Not if I go at night, find Coleman at his house rather than his office. I can be convincing when I need to be. Daniel shook his head. If you're going, I'm going with you. That defeats the purpose. Coleman won't talk with you there. He'll see it as a threat. Then I'll stay out of sight. Close enough to help if things go wrong, far enough to let you work. After more debate, they settled on a plan. Claire would approach Coleman at his home around midnight, when he'd be alone, probably drinking, possibly questioning his choices. She'd make the offer. Immunity protection a way out. Daniel would position himself 50 yards away, ready to intervene if Coleman turned hostile. The rest of the evening passed in tense preparation. Claire changed into dark clothing. Daniel checked his weapons, loaded extra ammunition. They studied a map of town, planned approach routes, and escape paths. At 11 o'clock, they rode out. The night was overcast, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Good for concealment, bad for visibility, they left their horses a quarter-mile from town and proceeded on foot. Coleman's house sat at the edge of the residential area, a modest structure with a small yard. Light showed in one window. Daniel positioned himself behind a tool shed with a clear view of the front door. Claire approached, boldly knocked 3 times. The door opened. Coleman stood there in his undershirt gun, in hand, eyes bleary. "What the hell?" he said when he recognized her. "I need to talk to you, privately. You got some nerve coming here. 5 minutes. That's all I ask." Coleman looked past her, scanning the darkness. Daniel held perfectly still, knowing the sheriff's eyes would be adjusted to the light from inside, unable to see into shadows. 5 minutes, Coleman finally said, stepping aside. The door closed behind them. Daniel waited, counting seconds. If Claire screamed if he heard a gunshot, he'd go in hard and fast. But he had to trust her judgment, her ability to read Coleman's state of mind. 10 minutes passed. 15. Then the door opened again. Claire emerged, walking backwards, still talking to someone inside. Coleman appeared in the doorway, looking older than Daniel had ever seen him. Claire turned and walked away, moving quickly but not running. When she reached Daniel's position, she grabbed his arm. "Move, now." They hurried back to the horses, mounted, and rode hard for Harrison's ranch. Only when they were well clear of town did Claire finally speak. "He'll do it. He'll testify." What convinced him? The truth. That Blackwell's going to kill him anyway. That he's a loose end just like Marcus was. And that this is his only chance to protect his family. He believed you. I showed him a copy of Marcus's death certificate. Suicide, it said. Then I told him I was at the spur the night Marcus came in drunk, talking about how scared he was, how Blackwell was cutting ties with everyone who knew too much. 2 days later, Marcus is dead from a supposedly self-inflicted gunshot. Daniel nodded grimly, and Coleman realized he's next on the list. Exactly. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. They reached Harrison's ranch to find everyone still awake, anxious for news. When Claire explained what had happened, the room erupted in cautious celebration. "When will he come?" Harrison asked. "Tomorrow. Says he needs 1 day to move his wife and children to her sister's place in Denver. Then he'll surrender himself and give a full statement." "Can we trust him?" Ruth asked. "No," Daniel said bluntly. "But we can verify everything he tells us. Cross-reference it with Claire's records and the evidence we've already gathered. If he lies, we'll know." Harrison stood. "Then tomorrow we begin building our case in earnest. Federal prosecutor arrives the day after. By week's end, we might actually have enough to charge Blackwell formally." Grace spoke quietly. "And then we pray the system works the way it's supposed to." The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Every rider on the horizon could be Coleman coming to help or Blackwell coming to kill. Every sound brought people to windows with weapons ready. Coleman arrived at dusk alone, looking like a man walking to his own execution. He carried a leather satchel that clinked with the weight of what proved to be years of documentation. Receipts, orders, correspondence. Everything Harrison had said they needed. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Coleman sat across from Harrison with Daniel and Grace, listening as he detailed every crime he'd been party to. Every bribe taken, every threat delivered, every murder he'd facilitated. When he reached the part about the mine collapse, Grace's hands clenched into fists. "Blackwell gave the order directly," Coleman said, his voice hollow. "Said Thomas Hartley was going to ruin everything. Said eliminate the problem, make it look accidental. I told the explosives expert which supports to weaken, which would cause maximum damage with minimum warning. 18 men died. I killed them all. No, Harrison said quietly. Blackwell killed them. You were the weapon he used. There's a difference, not to the widows. Grace stood abruptly and left the room. Daniel found her outside staring at the stars. He confessed, Daniel said. Full confession to Thomas's murder. I heard. This is what you wanted. Justice for Thomas. Is it because it doesn't feel like justice? It feels like a deal with the devil. Sometimes that's what justice requires. Compromises that taste like ashes. Grace turned to face him. How do you live with it? By remembering that perfect justice is impossible. We can only do our best with what we have. She nodded slowly, accepting, if not agreeing. The next morning, federal prosecutor Amanda Sterling arrived from Denver. She was 40-something, sharp-eyed, with the air of someone who'd won more cases than she'd lost. Harrison briefed her on everything while she took copious notes. When he finished, she sat back. This is the strongest case I've seen in years. Multiple witnesses, documentary evidence, a confession from law enforcement. Blackwell's lawyers will fight, but they'll lose. How long until trial? Daniel asked. Preliminary hearing first, to establish probable cause. 2 weeks minimum for that. Full trial could be months away. Blackwell won't wait months. He'll act. Sterling nodded. Federal marshals are on their way. Should arrive tomorrow. We'll have protection for all key witnesses. How many marshals? 5. Daniel did the math. 5 marshals plus 20 townspeople defended against however many men Blackwell could hire. Still not great odds, but better than before. Sterling spent the next 3 days preparing their case, interviewing every witness, organizing evidence into a coherent narrative. She was thorough professional and increasingly convinced of victory. On the 4th day, everything changed. A telegram arrived from Denver. Sterling read it, and her face went white. What? Harrison asked. Judge Aldridge has been assigned to the preliminary hearing. That's good, isn't it? Aldridge is respected, experienced. Aldridge is also on Blackwell's payroll. Federal investigators have been building a corruption case against him for months. But they haven't moved yet, and didn't want to tip him off. Daniel felt his stomach drop. So the hearing is rigged? Possibly. Probably. Unless we can prove Aldridge's corruption before the hearing. How? Sterling pulled out more telegrams. My contacts in Denver have been investigating. They have evidence of multiple bribe payments to Aldridge's account. But nothing directly traceable to Blackwell, and nothing that proves bias in this specific case. Then we need to catch him in the act, Claire said. Make him reveal his bias in open court. How? Grace asked. Claire smiled grimly. By baiting him. By presenting evidence so damning that an honest judge would have to rule in our favor. When Aldridge doesn't, when he makes obviously biased rulings, that itself becomes evidence. It was risky. If they revealed all their evidence in the preliminary hearing and Aldridge still ruled for Blackwell, they'd have shown their entire hand for nothing. But Sterling was warming to the idea. We'd need federal observers present, other judges, investigators, people who can document Aldridge's bias. Build a case for appeal and for his removal. Can you arrange that? Harrison asked. I can try. The next week was a blur of preparation. Witness statements were refined. Evidence was organized into the most damning possible presentation. Sterling practiced her arguments, anticipating every objection Blackwell's lawyers might raise. Coleman remained in protective custody, separated from the others, guarded constantly. He'd grown quieter as the hearing approached, the weight of his confession clearly crushing him. Daniel spent his time fortifying Harrison's ranch and planning for the worst. If the hearing went badly, if Aldridge ruled for Blackwell, they'd need to escape quickly. He mapped out routes, cached supplies, prepared for the possibility that they'd all become fugitives. Grace worked with Claire, going through every entry in her notebook, building timelines, connecting payments to crimes. The two women had formed an unlikely friendship, bound by shared trauma and determination. The night before the hearing, Daniel couldn't sleep. He found Grace on the porch, also awake. "Nervous?" he asked. "Terrified. Everything we fought for comes down to tomorrow. If we lose, if Aldridge rules for Blackwell, I don't know what we do next. We keep fighting. We appeal. We find another way. For how long? How many times can we get knocked down before we stay down?" Daniel didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he said, "Thomas would be proud of you, of how far you've come, how hard you've fought. Thomas would tell me I'm being reckless, that I should accept what I can't change and move on. But you're not him. You're you, and you don't give up." Grace looked at him in the darkness. "Neither do you." "Learned that in the war. At Shiloh, we held a position for 6 hours against superior forces. Lost half our company doing it. But we held on, because sometimes holding is victory enough. What if holding isn't enough this time? Then we'll find out together." The hearing was set for 10 in the morning at the federal courthouse in Denver. They arrived in a convoy of wagons surrounded by marshals. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, citizens, railroad employees. Word had spread about the case, and people wanted to see how it played out. Inside the courtroom was packed. Blackwell sat with his team of lawyers, 8 men in expensive suits. He looked confident, barely glancing at Daniel and Grace as they took their seats. Judge Aldridge entered, and everyone stood. He was 60-something, silver-haired, distinguished-looking. Everything a judge should appear to be. "Case of United States versus Charles Blackwell," he announced. "Charges include conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, fraud, and corruption. Miss Sterling, you may present the prosecution's case." Sterling stood. "Your Honor, the evidence will show a pattern of systematic criminal activity spanning 5 years and resulting in at least 20 deaths." She began methodically presenting documents. Land deeds showing suspicious transfers, financial records showing payments, Coleman's confession detailing specific orders from Blackwell. Blackwell's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Thompson, objected repeatedly. "Hearsay, Your Honor. These documents were obtained illegally." The witness is biased. Each time Aldridge sustained the objection. Daniel watched the pattern develop. Sterling would present solid evidence, Thompson would object on flimsy grounds, and Aldridge would side with the defense. It was subtle enough to seem like normal judicial discretion to a casual observer. But to anyone paying attention, the bias was clear. Sterling adjusted her strategy, focusing on the most ironclad evidence. Claire's notebooks with years of documented transactions. "Your Honor, these are contemporaneous records kept by a civilian observer. They document payments from Charles Blackwell to Sheriff Coleman, payments that coincide with specific acts of violence against property owners." Thompson stood. "This witness is a prostitute. Her credibility is suspect." Aldridge nodded. "Sustained. The court finds this witness lacks credibility." Murmurs ran through the gallery. That ruling was harder to justify. Claire's occupation had nothing to do with the accuracy of financial records. Sterling pressed on. "Then let's discuss the mine collapse. Federal inspectors found evidence of deliberate sabotage. Support beams weakened in a pattern consistent with planned demolition." She called an expert witness, a mining engineer, who explained in technical detail how the collapse had been engineered. Thompson objected. "Speculation." "Sustained," Aldridge said. Now the observers were taking extensive notes. Aldridge's bias was becoming undeniable. When Coleman took the stand, the tension in the room ratcheted higher. The former sheriff looked haggard, his hands trembling as he was sworn in. Sterling led him through his testimony. Coleman detailed every order from Blackwell, every crime, every cover-up. His voice was steady, his memory detailed. Thompson's cross-examination was brutal. "You're a confessed criminal testifying to avoid prison, correct?" "Yes." "You'd say anything to get a reduced sentence?" "No, I'm telling the truth." "A truth remarkably convenient for your purposes." Aldridge interrupted. "The court notes the witness's credibility is questionable given his admitted crimes." Sterling shot to her feet. "Your Honor, that's for the jury to decide, not the court. I'm making a preliminary finding for the record." The afternoon wore on. Each piece of evidence was challenged. Each ruling went against the prosecution. By 4 o'clock, it was clear which way Aldridge was leaning. Then Sterling played her final card. "Your Honor, we have one more witness. Via deposition, Margaret Hayes, Mr. Blackwell's former secretary." She presented the deposition taken in New York just days before. Margaret testified to typing every order, every communication, every piece of correspondence that proved Blackwell's direct involvement. Thompson objected. "Hearsay. The witness isn't present for cross-examination." "The deposition was taken under oath with defense counsel present," Sterling countered. "It's admissible." Aldridge hesitated. This was harder to dismiss. Federal observers were watching closely. If he threw out sworn testimony from a credible witness, his bias would be undeniable. "I'll allow it," he said finally. "But the court notes concerns about the witness's motivations." Sterling read Margaret's testimony aloud. It was damning. Specific dates, specific orders, specific amounts. Everything was corroborated by documents already in evidence. When she finished, this courtroom was silent. Then Judge Aldridge said the words that proved his corruption beyond doubt. "Having heard the evidence, this court finds insufficient probable cause to proceed to trial. Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted. Sterling was on her feet shouting objections. The gallery broke into chaos. Federal observers surrounded Aldridge, demanding explanations. "This is a travesty," Sterling yelled. "Your Honor, you've ignored overwhelming evidence." "My ruling stands," Aldridge said coldly. "Court is adjourned." Marshals moved to surround Coleman, protecting him from the surge of angry citizens. Blackwell stood smiling, shaking hands with his lawyers. Daniel felt the floor drop out from under him. They'd lost. Despite everything, despite the evidence, despite the confessions, they'd lost. But then something unexpected happened. One of the federal observers, an older man Daniel didn't recognize, strode to the front of the courtroom. "Judge Aldridge," he said loudly, "I'm Judge Warren, U.S. Circuit Court, and I'm formally charging you with corruption and obstruction of justice. Federal marshals, arrest this man." Aldridge went white. "You can't do this." "I just did. Your rulings today, combined with evidence of bribe payments we've been tracking for months, constitute more than enough cause." Marshals moved toward Aldridge. He tried to push past them, but they grabbed his arms. As he was being led away, Aldridge shouted at Blackwell, "You promised protection. You promised I'd be safe." Blackwell's smile vanished. Judge Warren took the bench. "This hearing is tainted by judicial corruption and is hereby voided. I'm ordering a new preliminary hearing in 1 week with myself presiding. Mr. Blackwell, you remain free on bail, but don't leave the jurisdiction. We will retry this matter properly." The courtroom erupted again, but this time in cheers rather than anger. Daniel grabbed Grace's hand. "We have another chance. Will it be different next time?" "Warren's honest. Everyone knows it. With him on the bench, we might actually win." Outside the courthouse, Sterling gathered the team. "This is good. Better than good. Warren's ruling means we get a clean shot at this. But we need to be ready. Blackwell's going to come at us hard in the next week." He'll try to intimidate witnesses, destroy evidence, maybe worse. Let him try, Coleman said quietly. I'm past caring about my own life. I just want to see him pay. That night back at Harrison's ranch, they allowed themselves cautious celebration. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Blackwell had been backed into a corner, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. He was right. 3 days later, word reached them that Blackwell had escaped. Gone in the night, leaving no trace. Federal marshals searched the territory, but he'd vanished. Then the telegram arrived. Charles Blackwell spotted a boarding train to Denver. William Blackwell en route from New York to join him. Both believed heading to railroad board meetings to secure contracts before arrest. Daniel read it and knew what they had to do. We go after them, he said. The marshals will handle it, Sterling replied. By the time marshals catch up, Blackwell will be protected by the railroad board. Lawyers, money, political influence. He'll disappear into the system. What are you suggesting? We stop him before he reaches Denver, before he gets that protection. Grace stood beside him. We're going after the train. Harrison looked between them. That's insane. You'll get yourselves killed. Maybe. But if we don't try, we've already lost. In the end, 6 of them made the decision to go. Daniel Grace Coleman, Claire Ruth Anderson, and Jack Miller. All people with personal stakes, all willing to risk everything for one last chance at justice. Sterling gave them her blessing, though she couldn't officially sanction what they were planning. If you somehow catch them, hold them until marshals arrive. Don't do anything that puts your case at risk. They left at dawn, riding hard for Copper Creek Station, the only place the express train would stop for water. If they missed it, there they'd never catch up. The ride was brutal. 60 miles in 6 hours, pushing horses to their limits. They changed mounts twice at relay stations, always moving, always racing the clock. They reached Copper Creek with minutes to spare. Daniel positioned everyone in cover, while Coleman, still wearing his sheriff badge, walked to the station master. Federal warrant for Charles Blackwell, Coleman said, showing papers Sterling had prepared. He's on the next train. We'll need you to delay departure. The station master shook his head. Can't do that without authorization from the line supervisor. Then get him. He ain't here. Daniel watched the horizon and saw smoke. The train was coming. He made a decision. Coleman, tell Blackwell we have Marcus. That you caught him alive, that he's here ready to trade. Marcus is dead. Blackwell doesn't know that. Tell him we have his star witness, his evidence, everything he needs to clear his name. But he has to come off the train to get it. It was a bluff, a trap, and a desperate gamble all at once. The train pulled in steam, hissing brakes, squealing. Coleman approached the private car at the rear, knocked on the door. It opened. Charles Blackwell looked out, saw Coleman, and frowned. What are you doing here? I have Marcus Hartley, the one who was supposed to be dead. He's alive. He's here, and he's willing to deal. Blackwell's eyes narrowed with suspicion. But greed won out. Where to? Water Tower. Said he'd only meet you personally. Blackwell conferred with someone inside the car. Then he and his brother William emerged, followed by 4 bodyguards. They walked toward the water tower, where Daniel had said Marcus would be waiting. Daniel and the others revealed themselves, guns drawn. That's far enough, Daniel called out. Blackwell stopped, realizing he'd been tricked. His hand moved toward his coat. Don't, Daniel warned. You're outnumbered and outgunned. You have no authority here, William said coldly. Federal warrant says otherwise. One of the bodyguards drew his weapon. Daniel shot him in the leg before he could aim. The man went down screaming. The other bodyguards raised their hands. Smart, Grace said from her position behind cover. Charles Blackwell's face twisted with rage. You think this changes anything? I'll be out on bail by tomorrow. My lawyers will destroy you. Maybe, Daniel agreed. But you'll still face trial. Real trial with an honest judge. And all your money won't buy you out of that. William tried to edge toward the train. Coleman blocked his path. Going somewhere. This is kidnapping. False arrest. No, this is justice catching up. Marshals arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by telegraph from Copper Creek. They took custody of both Blackwell brothers and their bodyguards. As Charles was being led away in chains, he locked eyes with Daniel. This isn't over. Yes, Daniel said quietly. It is. The train pulled away without the Blackwells. Daniel, Grace, and the others watched it disappear into the distance, carrying other passengers to other destinations, the world continuing, despite the drama that had just unfolded. Grace leaned against Daniel, exhausted. We did it. We actually did it. First step, trial's still ahead. But this time we're ready. They rode back to Harrison's ranch, arriving after dark. When Sterling heard what had happened, she was simultaneously furious and impressed. You could have ruined everything. If you'd hurt them, if you'd violated their rights, the whole case could have been thrown out. But we didn't, Daniel said. We caught them clean. And now they face justice. The new preliminary hearing happened 1 week later. Judge Warren presided, and this time every objection was fairly considered, every piece of evidence properly evaluated. When it was over, Warren looked at Charles and William Blackwell and said, This court finds overwhelming probable cause on all charges. Both defendants are remanded to federal custody pending trial. Bail is denied. The brothers were led away in chains. Outside reporters swarmed them with questions. Daniel said nothing, just walked past them all. Grace did the same. That night at Harrison's ranch, they finally allowed themselves to believe it might actually be over. Coleman sat alone on the porch smoking. Daniel joined him. You know I'm still going to prison, Coleman said. Yes. Deserved, I suppose? Yes, Daniel agreed. But you'll serve knowing you did the right thing at the end. That counts for something. Coleman was quiet for a moment. I had a choice once. Early on. Blackwell first approached me. I could have said no, should have said no. But I was in debt, desperate. Took his money. After that, every choice got harder. That's how it works. The first compromise leads to the second, then the third, until you can't see the line you crossed anymore. How did you avoid it? The war, Emma's death, everything. How did you not become like me? Daniel thought about that. Maybe I just got lucky. Or maybe I had people around me who kept me honest. Harrison, Grace, even you in your way. Me, seeing what you became, showed me what I could become if I let anger guide my choices. So thank you for that, I suppose. Coleman laughed bitterly. You're welcome. They sat in silence, two men on opposite sides of a divide, understanding each other perhaps better than they wanted to. The trial date was set for December, 2 months away. 2 months to prepare to rest, to rebuild. Daniel returned to his ranch to find it still standing, his cattle scattered but mostly alive. He began the work of repair, of restoration. Grace went with him. She didn't ask permission, didn't explain, just started working beside him, rebuilding what had been damaged. One evening, after a long day of fence work, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. This partnership of ours, Grace said. It's become something more, hasn't it? Yes, Daniel agreed. Are we going to talk about it? Do we need to? Grace smiled. I suppose not. But eventually, probably. Eventually, Daniel agreed. They were still sitting there when full darkness fell. Comfortable in the silence, comfortable with each other, comfortable with the uncertain future they were building together. The war wasn't over. The trial still loomed. But for the first time in years, Daniel felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. Winter arrived early that year. Snow dusted the mountains by mid-November, and by the time the trial date approached, Denver was locked in cold that made breath visible and turned the streets to frozen mud. Daniel stood at the window of his hotel room, watching the city wake. The federal courthouse loomed 3 blocks away, a massive stone building that represented everything he'd been fighting for. Justice, order, the rule of law. Grace appeared beside him, already dressed for court in a simple gray dress that managed to be both modest and dignified. "Couldn't sleep either," she asked. "Keep thinking about Emma, about Thomas, about everyone who died to get us to this moment." "They're watching," Grace said quietly. "Wherever they are, they're watching. I hope so." The trial of Charles Blackwell began at 9 o'clock sharp. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, people standing in the back and overflowing into the hallway. Reporters from newspapers across the territory jammed the front rows, pencils ready. Judge Warren took the bench with his characteristic stern efficiency. He was a man who believed in procedure, in fairness, in the careful application of law. Exactly what they needed. "United States versus Charles Blackwell," he announced. "Charges include conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of 18 minors, arson resulting in death, racketeering, fraud, and corruption of public officials." "How does the defendant plead?" Blackwell stood flanked by his legal team. He'd lost weight during his incarceration, his expensive clothes hanging loose on his frame. But his eyes still held that calculating intelligence. "Not guilty, Your Honor." "Very well. Ms. Sterling, you may present the prosecution's opening statement." Amanda Sterling rose, and the courtroom fell silent. "Gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and strong. "Over the next weeks, you will hear testimony about a man who built an empire on the graves of innocent people. Charles Blackwell is many things. He is wealthy, educated, a captain of industry. But he is also a murderer. Not in the heat of passion, not in self-defense, but in cold calculation. He ordered deaths the way other men order supplies. He destroyed families the way other men clear brush. And he did it all for one reason: profit. She walked along the jury box, making eye contact with each man. "The evidence will show a pattern spanning 5 years. Every time someone stood in the way of his railroad expansion, that person suffered. Their wells were poisoned. Their cattle died. Their homes burned. And when simple intimidation failed, they died. 18 miners in a single day, their deaths carefully engineered to look accidental. A young mother and her unborn child burned alive when their home was torched. Dozens more whose names we may never know." Sterling returned to her table, picked up a thick ledger. "This is Mr. Blackwell's own record of these crimes, written in his hand, documented with the precision of a bookkeeper. $5,000 for Thomas Hartley, $3,000 for Emma Morgan. Amounts paid to killers, amounts he considered acceptable costs of doing business." She set the ledger down with deliberate weight. "By the end of this trial, you will know beyond any doubt that Charles Blackwell is guilty. And you will have the opportunity to tell him and all men like him that in America no amount of money places you above the law." The defense attorney Thompson stood for his opening statement. He was smooth-polished and expensive. "Gentlemen, my client is a businessman, not a criminal. The prosecution will present you with a parade of criminals testifying to save themselves, bitter people, looking to blame their misfortunes on a successful man, and documents taken out of context. But they will not present you with proof that Charles Blackwell personally ordered any crimes, because that proof doesn't exist." It was a weak opening, and everyone knew it, but it was all Thompson had. The prosecution's case began with documentary evidence. Sterling methodically presented land deeds, financial records, the infamous ledger. Expert witnesses authenticated handwriting, explained timelines, connected payments to crimes. On the third day, Marcus's deposition was read into the record. Though he was dead, his sworn statement carried weight. He detailed recruitment by Blackwell, described specific conversations, provided dates and amounts that matched the ledger perfectly. Coleman took the stand on day 4. He'd aged years in the months since his arrest. His hands shook as he was sworn in, and his voice cracked on the first few words. But as Sterling led him through his testimony, he found strength in truth-telling. Mr. Blackwell told me explicitly that Thomas Hartley was a problem, Coleman said. He said, and I quote, "Eliminate him. Make it look accidental. I don't care about collateral damage." Thompson's cross-examination was brutal. "You're testifying to avoid hanging, aren't you?" "I'm testifying to tell the truth." "After years of lies. Why should anyone believe you now?" "Because I kept records. Because I have proof. Because even I have limits." Thompson tried to shake him, tried to find contradictions, but Coleman held firm. Whatever else he was prepared. Claire testified on day 5. She brought her notebook, years of observations and transactions, and walked the jury through the financial trail that led from Blackwell to Coleman to violence. Thompson tried his previous tactic. "You're a woman of questionable virtue, a prostitute." "Why should this jury trust your records?" Judge Warren interrupted before Sterling could object. "Counselor, this witness's occupation is irrelevant to the accuracy of financial records. Confine your questions to the documents themselves." Claire smiled slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor. To answer the question, these numbers don't lie. Every payment I recorded was verified by Mr. Coleman's own records, which you've already seen. The truth doesn't care about my virtue." The jury responded to that. Several men nodded. Margaret Hayes's deposition came next, read by Sterling in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. Margaret had been Blackwell's secretary for 8 years. She'd typed every order, filed every document, seen everything. Her testimony was devastating. Specific dates, specific instructions, specific amounts, all corroborated by physical evidence already presented. Thompson could only object weakly that she wasn't present for cross-examination, but Warren overruled him. The deposition had been properly taken with defense counsel present. On day 7, Grace took the stand. Daniel watched from the gallery as she walked to the witness box, her spine straight, her face composed. She'd been dreading this moment, he knew. Having to speak publicly about Thomas's death, about the journal that was stolen, about everything she'd lost. Sterling was gentle with her. "Mrs. Hartley, can you describe your husband's work at the mine?" Thomas was a mining engineer. He was responsible for safety inspections, structural integrity, ventilation systems. He took the work seriously. Lives depended on getting it right. Did he express concerns about safety? Constantly. He documented violations in a journal, showed them to supervisors, to mine management. He was told to ignore them, that the company couldn't afford delays. What happened when he persisted? Grace's voice remained steady. He planned to submit a formal report to federal inspectors. He told me the night before the collapse. Said it might cost him his job, but he couldn't stand by while men worked in unsafe conditions. The next day, the mine collapsed. 18 men died, including my husband. Sterling let that sit for a moment before continuing. You came to Coyote Ridge looking for someone named Marcus. Why? Marcus was Thomas's cousin. Thomas had sent him copies of the safety documentation, asked him to hold it safe. I thought if Thomas died, Marcus would have the evidence needed to prove the collapse wasn't accidental. But Marcus worked for Charles Blackwell. I learned that when I arrived. I learned my cousin-in-law had betrayed my husband, had helped kill him. Thompson stood for cross-examination, and Daniel tensed. This was the moment he'd been worried about. "Mrs. Hartley, you're romantically involved with Daniel Morgan, are you not?" Grace met his eyes without flinching. "I am. Mr. Morgan has had a vendetta against my client for years, hasn't he? Mr. Morgan sought justice for his wife's murder. If you consider that a vendetta, then yes. And you're helping his revenge scheme. No. I'm seeking justice for my husband and 17 other minors who died because your client valued profit over lives. You expect this jury to believe you're objective? I expect this jury to look at the evidence. Documents don't have vendettas, Mr. Thompson. Numbers don't seek revenge. The truth stands regardless of who presents it." Thompson tried several more angles, but Grace remained unshakable. When she stepped down, Daniel saw tears in her eyes, but her head was still high. Daniel testified on day 8. He detailed his 5-year investigation, the evidence he'd gathered, the pattern he'd documented. Thompson tried to paint him as obsessed as manufacturing evidence to support a predetermined conclusion. "Isn't it true you blamed my client for your wife's death long before you had any proof?" "I blamed the person responsible. As I gathered evidence, that person's identity became clear." "But you started with a conclusion and worked backward." "No. I started with questions and followed evidence to answers. That's called investigation." The trial continued for 3 weeks. Witness after witness, document after document, the case built like a wall of stone, each piece supporting the others, creating a structure that couldn't be knocked down. The defense tried. Thompson called character witnesses businessmen who praised Blackwell's acumen, his charitable donations, his vision for progress. But none of them could address the specific charges. None of them had been present for the crimes. Blackwell himself did not testify. His lawyers advised against it, knowing Sterling would destroy him on cross-examination. The defense's case lasted 2 days, then closing arguments. Sterling addressed the jury with quiet intensity. "Gentlemen, the evidence is overwhelming. You've seen the documents. You've heard the testimony. You've watched witnesses corroborate each other's statements with details they couldn't have invented. Charles Blackwell ordered murders. He paid for them. He profited from them. The only question before you is whether you have the courage to hold a wealthy man accountable for crimes that would hang a poor man without hesitation." She paused, letting that sink in. This isn't about class warfare or jealousy of success. This is about justice. Pure and simple. 18 miners didn't come home one day because Charles Blackwell decided their lives were worth less than his schedule. Emma Morgan burned to death because she owned land he wanted. Thomas Hartley died underground because he threatened to expose unsafe conditions. Those deaths demand accountability. The law demands it. Justice demands it. And I believe you will deliver it. Thompson's closing was technically proficient, but emotionally hollow. He argued reasonable doubt attacked witness credibility and suggested alternative explanations. But his heart wasn't in it. He knew what the jury knew. His client was guilty. Judge Warren gave jury instructions clear and precise. The 12 men filed out to deliberate. The wait was agony. Daniel paced the courthouse hallway. Grace sat on a bench, hands folded outwardly, calm. Claire stood at a window watching the street. Coleman sat alone, head bowed, praying, or simply existing. Daniel couldn't tell which. 6 hours passed. Then word came. The jury had reached a verdict. Everyone filed back into the courtroom. The spectator section filled instantly, people pushing for position. Judge Warren called for order, threatening to clear the room if people couldn't remain quiet. The jury foreman stood a middle-aged farmer named Henderson. He held a piece of paper, his hand rock steady. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Warren asked. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, in the deaths of 18 miners, how do you find—" Henderson's voice carried to every corner of the room. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Warren's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Order, I will have an order. Silence fell, but the energy in the room was electric. Henderson continued through every charge: arson resulting in death, guilty; racketeering, guilty; fraud, guilty; corruption of public officials, guilty; every count, guilty. Charles Blackwell's face was drained of color. His lawyers put hands on his shoulders, preventing him from standing, from speaking, from doing anything that might make matters worse. Grace's hand found Daniel's. Her fingers were ice cold and trembling. Judge Warren addressed the defendant. Charles Blackwell, a jury of your peers has found you guilty on all counts. These are capital crimes. However, given your cooperation in identifying other conspirators and the testimony of witnesses who chose conscience over complicity, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. You will be transferred to federal penitentiary immediately. May God have mercy on your soul. Marshals moved forward, placed Blackwell in chains. As they led him past Daniel, the industrialist stopped. This changes nothing, he said quietly. The railroad will be built. Progress continues. You've won nothing. I've won justice for Emma, Daniel replied. That's everything. Blackwell was led away. The courtroom dissolved into celebration. Reporters rushed for the doors, racing to file their stories. Victims' families embraced, crying and laughing at once. Outside, the winter sun was setting, painting the snow-covered city in shades of gold and rose. Daniel stood on the courthouse steps, breathing free air, feeling something that had been locked inside him for 5 years, finally released. Grace stood beside him. It's really over. Yes. What do we do now? We live, we rebuilt. We remember them by living well. But even as he said it, Daniel felt uneasy. Something wasn't finished. Some threat still lingered. His instincts were proven correct the next morning. A man appeared at Harrison's ranch, where they'd all gathered to celebrate and rest. He arrived in an expensive carriage drawn by matched horses, his clothes tailored, his bearing aristocratic. My name is Victor Blackwell, he announced. Charles's cousin. I've come to make you an offer. Daniel met him at the door, blocking entry. Not interested. You haven't heard it yet. Don't need to. Your cousin's in prison. That's enough of an answer, enough. Victor smiled, and it was colder than the winter wind. My cousin was emotional. I made mistakes. I don't make mistakes. The Colorado Railroad expansion will continue. I'm now in charge. But we can do this 2 ways. Peaceful, where everyone is fairly compensated and we all move forward. Or painful, where I use every legal means at my disposal to destroy you, bankrupt you, tie you in courts for decades. That's a threat, Grace said from behind Daniel. That's business. I'm offering a transaction. Drop your civil suits. Accept fair market compensation for damages. Let the past stay buried. In return, I ensure the railroad is built properly, safely, with no further crimes. You expect us to trust Blackwell? Claire asked. I expect you to recognize reality. Charles is gone. But the railroad has investors, board members, and political backing. It's bigger than one man. I'm offering you the chance to be part of progress rather than obstacles to it. Harrison stepped forward. What guarantees do you offer? Written contracts, federal oversight, complete transparency in land acquisitions going forward. And my personal assurance that what happened under Charles will never happen again. It was a good offer. Too good. Daniel knew it was a trap, but he couldn't quite see how. We need time to consider, Harrison said. You have 48 hours. After that, my offer expires and legal warfare begins. Victor departed, leaving behind an envelope with formal terms. The debate lasted through the night. It's everything we fought for, Ruth Anderson argued. Fair compensation, safe practices, justice served. It lets him win, Grace countered. He's using his cousin's conviction to seize power. We're helping him profit from Charles's crimes. The families need money, Jack Miller said. Winter's coming. Debts are piling. Pride doesn't feed children. Coleman, listening from the corner, finally spoke. It's a trick. Has to be. Victor's smarter than Charles, more ruthless. He wouldn't offer this unless it benefits him more than us. Then what's his angle? Harrison asked. Don't know yet, but it's there. In the end, they voted. 12 families in favor of accepting Victor's offer, 5 against. Democracy won. Daniel negotiated the final terms with Victor. $100,000 divided among affected families. Written acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Federal safety inspectors stationed at all railroad work sites. And one additional requirement. You testify at William's trial, Daniel said. Victor raised an eyebrow. William, your other cousin, the one in New York who funded Charles's operations. He's being charged as a co-conspirator. You testify to what you know about his involvement or no deal. Victor considered this carefully. Daniel saw calculation happening behind those cold eyes. William Blackwell was a rival, another potential heir to the family fortune. Removing him would consolidate Victor's power. Agreed, Victor said finally. I'll testify to facts I personally witnessed. Nothing more. They shook hands. Daniel felt like he'd just made a deal with something dark and dangerous, but the families needed this. Justice couldn't be the only priority. William Blackwell's trial began 2 weeks later. It was shorter than Charles's, much of the evidence already established. But Victor's testimony was the linchpin. He took the stand wearing an expression of sorrowful duty, a man forced to betray family for the sake of truth. William funded the entire Colorado operation, Victor testified. I was present at a family dinner in December 1884 when he explicitly told Charles to, and I quote, accelerate the timeline, remove all obstacles. I don't care about body count. He authorized $50,000 for what he called necessary expenses. We all knew what that meant. Sterling pressed him for details, and Victor provided them with devastating precision. Dates, amounts, specific conversations. All of it was corroborated by documents William's former secretary, Margaret, had provided. William's conviction took only 3 days of deliberation. Life in prison, same as his cousin. But as Daniel watched Victor leave the courthouse after testifying, he saw something in the man's expression, satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of justice served, but of competition eliminated. He played us, Daniel said quietly to Grace. What do you mean? He used the trial to take out William. Now he controls the entire Blackwell fortune. The railroad, everything. We gave him the empire he wanted. Grace paled. Can we stop it? Not legally. He hasn't committed any crimes we can prove. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat on Harrison's porch, rifle across his lap, watching the darkness. Something felt wrong. Victor was too confident, too satisfied. Men like that didn't just walk away after losing. At midnight, a rider approached fast. One of Harrison's ranch hands, his horse lathered and heaved. Judge Mr. Morgan, federal marshals, just arrested Victor Blackwell. Everyone tumbled out of the house. What, why? Harrison demanded. Hired assassin. Caught setting up a sniper position near the courthouse. Confessed that Victor paid him to eliminate key witnesses. Starting with you, Mr. Morgan. Daniel felt cold wash over him. When, tomorrow, during the celebration ceremony, you were all going to be on the courthouse steps for photographs. Perfect target situation. Where's Victor now? Federal custody. They have the assassin's signed confession, payment records, everything. He's done. The next morning, they learned the full scope. Victor had planned to eliminate Daniel, Grace, Coleman, and Claire. With the primary witnesses dead, and both his cousins in prison, he would control the Blackwell interests, with no one left who could testify against him. But the assassin, a professional killer named Graves, had gotten nervous about killing so many people in broad daylight. He'd gone to federal marshals with his concerns and been offered immunity to testify. Victor's trial was swift. Conspiracy to commit murder. The assassin testified. Payment records were clear. Victor was sentenced to life, joining his cousins in federal prison. The whole family, Grace said wonderingly. All three of them. Gone. Justice, Daniel said. Real justice, finally. The celebration that had been planned for the courthouse steps happened at Harrison's ranch instead. All the families, all the defenders, everyone who'd fought together. Coleman was there too, though, in chains and under guard. His sentence was 20 years for his role in Blackwell's crimes, with possibility of parole in 10 if he maintained good behavior. He approached Daniel during the gathering. I wanted to say goodbye. They're transferring me tomorrow. Good luck, Daniel said. I don't deserve it, but thank you. Coleman paused. I know this doesn't fix anything I did, but I'm glad we stopped them. All of them. Me too. Coleman started to turn away, then stopped. One more thing. There's someone outside. Rode this morning, says he needs to speak with you urgently. Daniel frowned and walked to the front of the house. A man stood by the gate, well-dressed, nervous. Mr. Morgan, my name is Richard Hayes, Margaret's brother. I came to warn you. There's a fourth Blackwell. Daniel went cold. What? Cousin from the East Coast branch. Nathaniel Blackwell. He's gathering resources, hiring lawyers, planning to appeal all 3 convictions. Says his family was railroaded, no pun intended. He's dangerous, and he's coming. When? Already here. I arrived in Denver yesterday. Daniel ran back inside, found Judge Warren, who was attending the celebration. We have a problem. Warren listened, then shook his head. The convictions are solid. Appeals will fail. Nathaniel can hire all the lawyers he wants, but the evidence is overwhelming. It's not just about courts, Daniel said. If he's anything like his cousins, he'll try other methods. We'll be ready. But Daniel's unease remained. He found Grace told her everything. It never ends, does it? She said quietly. It will, eventually. Just not today. The next morning proved Daniel's instincts correct. Gunfire erupted from the tree line east of Harrison's ranch. A single-shot professional from a distance. Coleman, who'd been standing on the porch saying goodbye to his family before transfer, jerked backward. Blood bloomed on his chest. He collapsed. Daniel dove for cover, pulling Grace down with him. More shots followed, but Wild panicked. The sniper was fleeing. Harrison's men mounted up, gave chase. They found the rifle still warm, but no shooter. Daniel knelt beside Coleman, pressing hands against the wound. Blood pumped between his fingers. Too much blood. Get a doctor, he shouted. But Coleman grabbed his wrist. No point. Lung shot. I'm done. Don't talk like that. Daniel. Coleman's voice was fading. I'm glad. Saved someone. Finally. He died there on Harrison's porch, his last act one of redemption rather than corruption. His family wept over his body while marshals searched for the assassin. They found evidence 3 hours later. A hotel room rented to Nathaniel Blackwell. Maps of Harrison's ranch. Sniper equipment. The man himself was gone and fled on the morning train. Warrants were issued. A manhunt began. But Nathaniel had money and connections. He disappeared into the machinery of wealthy criminals who knew how to hide. The funeral was held 2 days later. Coleman was buried in Coyote Ridge, despite protests from some who felt he didn't deserve that honor. Grace argued for it. He died trying to be better than he was. That deserves something. Daniel agreed. As they stood by the grave, Grace took his hand. I'm tired of fighting. Me too. Can we just live now? Just be... Yes, I think we can. They returned to Daniel's ranch, which had been repaired during the trials. The barn was rebuilt stronger than before. The fences mended. The cattle returned. Spring arrived slowly that year, winter reluctant to release its grip. But by April, green was showing on the hills and wildflowers dotted the meadows. Daniel was working on a new corral when Grace found him. I have something to tell you. He set down his hammer, turned to face her. These past months, working together, fighting together, nearly dying together. She paused, gathering words. I've fallen in love with you, not instead of Thomas. In addition to who I became after losing him, and I don't know what to do about that. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I love you too. Have for a while now. Been afraid to say it because it felt like betraying Emma, but I don't think she'd see it that way. I think she'd want me to live. Really live. Thomas would want that for me too. So what do? We stop pretending this is just a business arrangement. We admit we're building something together. Daniel stepped closer, took her hands in his. Grace Hartley, I'm not good with fancy words, but I know I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to work beside you, laugh with you, face whatever comes with you. Will you marry me? On one condition. Name it. I keep my name, Grace Hartley Morgan. I don't erase my past. Thomas was part of my life. He shaped who I am. I won't pretend otherwise. I wouldn't want you to. Then yes, absolutely yes. They were married in June on the ranch under open sky with mountains as witnesses. Claire served as Grace's attendant, looking radiant, in a proper dress, her years at the spur, a fading memory. Harrison performed the ceremony, his old voice strong with emotion. The entire community attended. All the families they'd fought beside, all the people who'd stood up when it mattered. Ruth Anderson brought food enough to feed an army. Jack Miller played fiddle, his wounded leg barely slowing him down. The vows were simple. Traditional words given new weight by everything they'd survived to reach this moment. When Harrison pronounced them married, the cheer that went up could be heard in town 3 miles away. That evening, as the celebration continued, Daniel and Grace slipped away to the porch. They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun set over their land. Happy to... Daniel asked. More than I thought possible a year ago. Same. Do you think it's really over the fighting? With the Blackwells, probably not. Men like Nathaniel don't stop. But we stopped the worst of them. That's something. It's everything, Grace corrected. She leaned her head on his shoulder. We stood up. We didn't break. We won. Yes, we did. As darkness fell and stars emerged, the celebration moved inside. Music and laughter drifted out to where they sat. Ready to go back in? Grace asked. In a minute. Just want to sit here with you a bit longer. I can do that. They remained there, two people who'd lost everything, and found each other in the wreckage building something new from the ruins of their past. The war for justice had been won. Now the work of living began. Old Daniel finished his story as the last light faded from the sky. Ben sat motionless, absorbing everything he'd heard. So Nathaniel Blackwell got away. For a time. Marshals caught him 5 years later in Mexico. He died in prison in 1910. Natural causes, though, some said guilt finally caught up with him. And everyone else? Claire married Harrison's son, started her own geology firm. She died last spring at 73, successful and respected. Ruth Anderson ran for mayor, once served 2 terms, changed Coyote Ridge from the ground up. Jack Miller expanded his ranch, became one of the biggest cattle operations in the territory. Died rich and happy in 35. And Grandma Grace? Daniel smiled. Come inside. She'll tell you herself. They walked into the house where Grace sat by the fire reading. At 81, she was still sharp, still strong, still the woman who'd said, "That's perfect," and meant it. Telling stories again, Daniel. Our story. Grace looked at Ben. Did he make us sound heroic? Yes, ma'am. We weren't. We were terrified most of the time, but we did what needed doing. Ben sat across from her. Was it worth it? All the danger, the fear? Grace and Daniel exchanged a look, a lifetime of understanding passing between them. Your great-uncle Thomas tried to fight corruption alone, Grace said. He failed because he had no support, no allies. We succeeded because we had each other. Community. That's the lesson, Ben. Never fight alone, but always fight. Even when you're scared. Especially then. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. Daniel added, your generation will face different fights, different enemies, but the principle remains. Stand up, stand together. Don't let fear or greed or power crush what's right. Ben nodded slowly. I'll remember. Good boy. Now go tell your mother dinner's ready. After Ben left, Grace moved to sit beside Daniel. Their children and grandchildren filled the house with noise and life. The ranch outside stretched in the darkness, productive and prosperous, a legacy built on principle. Do you ever regret it? Grace asked. The danger we put ourselves in? No. You? Not once. Though I wish Coleman had lived. He deserved that second chance. He got a moment of redemption. That's more than many people get. True. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to family laughter from the other room, feeling the weight of years and the lightness of choices made right. That night at the spur, Grace said suddenly, when Jake said one bed, I was so angry, so tired, so desperate. And I said, that's perfect. I didn't mean the bed. What did you mean? I meant the opportunity. To prove I wouldn't be ashamed. To claim my space in the world. To refuse to apologize for surviving. She smiled. Turned out to be true in ways I never imagined. Daniel took her hand, weathered fingers, intertwining. Everything good in my life came from that night. From you standing up. Everything good came from us standing together. The dinner bell rang. They stood slowly, age making movement careful, and walked together to join their family. Later, after everyone had eaten and the younger children were put to bed, Daniel found himself alone with Ben one more time. Grandpa, one more question. Ask. If you had to do it all again, knowing the danger, the pain, everything, would you? Daniel looked out the window at the ranch he'd built, at the family he'd raised, at the legacy of courage and principle he was leaving behind. Every single time, he said. Some things are worth fighting for, worth dying for if it comes to that. But more importantly, worth living for. You remember that. I will. That night, Daniel lay in bed beside Grace, their bedroom large and comfortable, filled with 53 years of shared life. Still perfect, he murmured. Grace smiled in the darkness. Still perfect. Outside, stars wheeled overhead. The mountains stood eternal. The land stretched away in all directions, free and wild and beautiful. And on a modest headstone in Coyote Ridge Cemetery, weathered by decades of wind and snow, 2 names were carved side by side. Thomas Hartley, Emma Morgan. Neither forgotten, both honored. their sacrifices the foundation on which others built lives worth living. Justice had been served. Love had been found. The stand had been worth taking. And somewhere in the darkness, in the vast sweep of history and human struggle, their story became one more thread in the tapestry of people who chose courage over comfort, principle over profit, justice over ease. The perfect stand. Not because it was easy or safe or certain, but because it was right.